Okay, good evening, everyone. I am Yann Lemerdi, Deputy Cultural Attaché at Villa Albertine, the cultural services of the French Embassy in the US, and I am delighted to welcome you tonight for this new episode of Museum Talks, live here from the VMFA, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, Virginia. So tonight we're having a new program of Museum Talks, our series of online talks dedicated to French arts in American museums. So tonight we are honored to host Theresa A. Cunningham and Sylvain Cordier for a discussion on the exhibition Experimental Lines, Impressionist and Postimpressionist Drawings at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts with our great moderator, Faya Causey. So Faya is a scholar, lecturer, and educator with interests ranging from the Paleolithic to the present. She earned her PhD from UC Santa Barbara in California and began her career as a professor of art history. She recently retired as head of academic programs at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Although her primary field is ancient art and her most recent books are on amber, her first publications were on the Impressionists Pissarro and Caillebotte. Her most recent work is on Michelangelo and more recently even on Paul Cézanne. So Faya, thanks for being with us tonight. Sylvain and Theresa, thanks for joining us and for what promises to be a very exciting museum talks, right?
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Jan. And thank you all online for joining us this evening. I mean, here we are in Richmond at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in just one of its many marvelous galleries. We are just inside the exhibition that is the focus of our museum talk this evening, Experimental Lines, Impressionist and Post-Impressionist Drawings from the collection of Mr. and Mrs. Paul Mellon. With me this evening are curators Sylvain Cordier and Theresa Cunningham. Sylvain Cordier is the Paul Mellon curator and head of the Department of European Art. Born and raised in Paris, France, he received his PhD in art history from the Paris Sorbonne University. Originally a specialist of 18th century and 19th century decorative arts, he has gone on and expanded research in the dialogue between decorative and visual arts, the relationship between artistic creation and discourses of power, and the art of portraiture in pre-contemporary Europe. Before joining the VMFA in 2019, he held several positions in academia and museums in Europe and in North America. I'll just mention one of his critically acclaimed international exhibition projects. He was the organizing curator of Napoleon, the Imperial Household. It was presented here in 2018 under the title Napoleon, Power and Splendor.
Thank you very much, Faya, for this introduction. I'll actually be very brief because I want to leave the speech to Theresa Cunningham, who's the curator of this wonderful exhibition, gathering some of the most amazing drawings that we have in the Mellon collection of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. We are here in the Mellon Galleries of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and I can say that the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, which is the museum of the state of Virginia, would not be what it is without the support of Paul and Bonnie Mellon. Support in providing vision for the museum, support also in providing collections from their exquisite gathering of artworks. We are, thanks to them, a museum that's free of charge for everyone. And I think it's something important to remember that it's thanks to the vision of Paul Mellon that the VMFA is free of charge for all visitors. It's also a place where we can admire a wonderful collection of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist art, as well as British and European sporting art. And something that is lesser known by our public is the quality of the works on paper that Paul and Bonnie Mellon have entrusted the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. We have about 1,500 pieces of drawings, watercolors, and prints in the collection. And what is particularly enjoyable and fascinating with this selection that Dr. Teresa Cunningham has made here with this exhibition is to see how rich in the domain of Impressionism that selection is. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Teresa Cunningham. And Faya, you're going to do that.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sylvain. I just want to say again how important it is. This museum is open 365 days a year, daily 10 to 5 p.m. and on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays until 9 p.m. Now I'll go back to my introduction to Teresa. Teresa Cunningham is the assistant curator of European art and the Mellon collections. She joined the Museum of Fine Arts in 2023. She received her BA from Boston College, an MA from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, and a PhD from the Pennsylvania State University. A specialist in 19th century French art, her writing has appeared in many notable art history publications. Before she came to the VMFA, she held notable positions, including at the Dixon Gallery and Gardens in Memphis, Tennessee, and in the Department of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the Philadelphia Museum. Now, Teresa is going to take us into the show. Her tour will just about be 35 minutes. At about 6:45, we will start taking questions from the audience, and that will last till about 7. Now, if you have any questions or comments during this talk, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be able to ask them at the appropriate time. But now it's Teresa's time.
Thank you, Faya and Sylvain, for those generous introductions. And thank all of you for joining us online. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the exhibition, Experimental Lines, Impressionist and Post-Impressionist Drawings from the collection of Mr. and Mrs. Paul Mellon. The exhibition was organized, it opened in March to coincide with the 150th anniversary of the First Impressionist Exhibition, which opened April 15th, 1874. When I arrived at VMFA in 2023, I was eager to get to know the works on paper collection. And when I was spending time in storage, getting to see the works in the Mellon collection, I realized that they had in to VMFA works by almost all of the major Impressionist artists, as well as a number of Post-Impressionists and notable artists from the beginning of the 19th century. And so many of these works had not been on view, especially at VMFA in recent years. And so I was eager to kind of bring them together in a way that would highlight them for the public. And I started to look at them and realize that they, you know, even though they dealt with disparate subject matter and throughout the 19th century, showed the way that drawing was essential for the Impressionists when they were experimenting and working through new ideas. There are so many wonderful exhibitions and programs this year to celebrate the sesquicentennial of the opening that have showed Impressionists and their relationship to other artists working in this time. And I wanted to highlight the works on paper because these are often underlooked at or kind of fall to the wayside next to some of these more famous paintings. But we have wonderful objects here at VMFA, and they help us to understand the importance of drawing practice within the larger Impressionist project. So for this exhibition, I've assembled 21 works. But to start, I think in a way it's very useful to understand what happened earlier in the 19th century when we're talking about Impressionism, because it helps us to see why the movement was so different, so innovative, and why it was so, viewers who saw it in the 19th century were taken aback when they first saw these works because it was so unfamiliar to them. And so the first half of the show, you'll look at on PowerPoint, and then we'll finish up our tour in person. But the exhibition opens with a drawing by Jean-Auguste-Dominique Ingres. It is a portrait of the Reverend Joseph Church. Ingres is the foremost practitioner of neoclassicism. He was the most lauded draftsman of the early 19th century. As a student at the École des Beaux-Arts, he won a prize, the Prix de Rome, which enabled him to travel and study in Rome. And he really loved this time, and he found it to be very fruitful. And so when he finished his, exhausted all of his prize winnings, he didn't want to leave. And so he started a business doing portrait drawings of other visitors to Rome, people who were traveling through on the Grand Tour. And he created a series of portrait drawings for these visitors to take home with them as kind of a souvenir of their travels abroad. And one of those is what you're looking at right now. You can see here he's giving a lot of careful attention and detail to the face of the sitter, who was a preacher from England who had traveled to Rome with his brother. We see a very sensitive portrayal of him, but this was a very robust business for Ingres. And so he was making quite a lot of these drawings and working relatively quickly. So while he devotes a lot of care and attention and, very small, precise lines to the face, we can see the rest of the sitter is executed much more quickly. If you look at the buttons on his coat or even the arm of the chair that he's sitting in, we see a lot of rapidly executed, quick, sketchy lines. And so there's a tension here between sort of this precision and careful linearity that is the hallmark of neoclassicism, and these loose, more expressionist brushstrokes that would find their way into Impressionism. And so it's a sort of precursor to the movement that's to come. In the 19th century, Ingres was often placed in conversation with his younger colleague, Eugène Delacroix, who shared, and the critics of the early 19th century kind of set up a dichotomy between Ingres' interest in line and Delacroix's interest in color. Delacroix was associated with a younger artistic movement called Romanticism that emphasized emotion and was looking towards, literature as inspiration. Delacroix, if you look at the drawing of the daffodil that we see here, this watercolor, though, you can get a sense that line and color are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And a beautiful rendering of this flower, very precise. Delacroix created a series of still lifes later in his life, and he created these watercolors with sort of the precision of a naturalist, and then incorporated them into later compositions. But if you look closely, you'll see that the edges of the watercolors kind of bleed over the graphite outlines, and we have a real tension at play between the color and the line, and we can see them working in concert together to create the depiction, and that it's not necessarily one over the other. Later in his career, Delacroix traveled to Morocco. He participated in a French diplomatic envoy that was hugely influential on his career. Even though he only made this one trip to North Africa, North African themes would predominate throughout his work for the rest of his life. What we have here is one page from a sketchbook that he kept while on these travels, devoted entirely to camels. We see them in different poses, different expressions on their faces, and we also see the drawings executed with varying levels of finish. We can imagine that Delacroix made these works on site, but that perhaps later, when he returned to his room at the end of the day, he enhanced different aspects of them in certain ways, highlighting some of them with watercolor and adding in additional details. And he would kind of save these sketchbooks and return to them throughout his career. And we see different aspects of them that he would incorporate into paintings. He would often look to them as inspiration throughout the rest of his life. As we got later into the 19th century, we see an emphasis on working outdoors, of depicting everyday life, the kinds of subject matter that the Impressionists were famous for. However, these tropes have their roots in earlier 19th century movements. The Barbizon school in particular was a big inspiration for the Impressionists, and we're looking at this late drawing by the Barbizon artist Corot, which depicts a landscape in the forests of Fontainebleau, a place that they travel to regularly thanks to access facilitated by the expanding railroad. We look here and we can see careful pen lines that have kind of sketched out the trees and the landscape, but then he's gone back in with ink wash to kind of highlight and give a more expressionist approach to this, adding we can imagine this sort of prefiguring, the broken brushwork and quick line work that the Impressionists were known for. Corot was, in addition to being an inspiration, was also a teacher to Bert Morisot. And so he had a very active role in shaping Impressionism. And I think this drawing rather kind of prefigures the way that they would kind of take up this mantle and shows the relationship between the groups. The next is a watercolor by Boudon, also an important precursor and teacher to the Impressionists. Boudon is best known for his landscapes and seascapes. Corot called him the king of the skies, but he also did a number of watercolors depicting figures that he observed on his travels. These are two Breton women in costume. He was very interested in these regional costumes and figures in their kind of traditional dress. And he would keep these sketchbooks and sometimes incorporate these figures into larger paintings. Boudon was Monet's teacher, and later Monet would kind of return the favor by inviting Boudon to participate in the First Impressionist Exhibition. So we see also when we were looking at these drawings, the interplay between the previous generation and the Impressionists and the way that sometimes the lines between them were not so clearly fixed. Another important model for the Impressionists, especially in the depiction of scenes of everyday life, was Constantin Guy. He was solely a draftsman, best known for his watercolors and drawings that were used to make illustrations for the newspapers in London and Paris. He worked especially as a correspondent during the Crimean War, creating images that were used to illustrate the news. This is from a series of watercolors that he made late in his life after he returned to Paris and was no longer working as a news correspondent. But what I love about it is that it shows the kind of hustle and bustle of the modern house-managed city, and in it you see electric lights, big crowds, all sorts of posters, advertising, new kinds of stores and services that were for sale. But you also see here on the right-hand side, a woman who is selling newspapers. So it's sort of a homage to Guy's earlier career as a newspaper reporter. The Impressionists really begin to solidify as a group in the late 1860s and early 1870s, but many of them had been practicing artists in the decades before that as well. And in this early drawing by Pissarro from 1857, we can sort of see Pissarro in particular, working through his relationship to the art of a previous generation. I see this drawing in particular as him kind of thinking through Barbizon school painting and landscape in particular. This is it's a tree, or perhaps it's a small thorny bush, but we see it in a rocky landscape with a field behind. And if you look closely, and I will say all of the drawings really reward careful and close looking. So if you have the opportunity to come to Richmond and see the show, please do so. As Faya said, we're open every day. But in this drawing, you can see every single individual leaf clearly articulated, each branch, a real attention to line with the same kind of precision that we saw earlier when we were looking at the Ingres drawing and his careful rendering of the face of Reverend Church. Pissarro has given the same kind of focused and precise attention to this tree. However, similarly to the Ingres drawing, as we kind of work our way outward from that central part of the composition, things become much looser, much more free. We see the rocks that are shaded with this repetitive lines and cross-hatching, and the landscape that slowly starts to bleed into this paper support. This drawing was originally made on a green sheet of paper that has since faded, but in the 1850s, the green of the paper would have really highlighted and emphasized the green of the trees and the field behind. So it would have been a kind of purposeful selection to sort of enhance the subject matter. Another work in the show is this watercolor by Bert Morisot, which depicts the harbor at Cherbourg, a town in Normandy, northern France. We often think of Morisot as a painter of interior scenes, of depictions of her family, especially her sister, her daughter, her nieces. However, as I mentioned earlier, Morisot trained with Corot, and she has a kind of very extensive landscape practice as well. And she made a number of depictions of boats, of harbor scenes, throughout her career. Often they were made on vacation with her family. This one is from Normandy, but she has similar images from Nice in southern France, from the Isle of Wight, where she traveled with her husband on her honeymoon. And in this drawing, we see, the ship is in the main feature, but Impressionists often dealt with changing cities and industrialization in sort of very subtle ways. So if we look in the background of this drawing, we can see a smokestack in the background, factories, suggesting sort of the change in this town from kind of a site of leisure and vacationing to also the emergence of new industries. It was fairly unusual for women painters to set up their easels and work outdoors at this time. So often Morisot was accompanied by her husband, who would work alongside her. She married Eugène Manet, the brother of the famed artist Edouard Manet. But she also found the amount of comments that she got, especially while making these harbor scenes, to be so irritating that later works she would make from a boat, because when she was in the harbor itself, no one could bother her while she was working. Although that presented its own challenges because she had to kind of factor against the movement of the boat. And so she was sort of grappling with her own kind of struggles with drawing as she worked out composition, light, color, et cetera, with the motion of the boat. But I think in the end, she found it was easier to deal with those concerns rather than the comments of observers. We also have a work by Pierre-Auguste Renoir in the exhibition. This is called The Milliner. And the model for this work is Suzanne Valadon, who was a noted artist in her own right, but also a good friend to the Impressionists and a frequent model for Renoir, as well as some of his colleagues. We see her here in a winter jacket carrying a large basket that suggests to us that she is a milliner, a purveyor of hats. So her basket is large enough that she can carry a hat. She's making deliveries to potential customers. And this drawing was made in preparation for the large canvas, The Umbrellas, at the National Gallery in London. And Renoir made this painting during the 1880s, during a period of transition and mild crisis in his life. He was really struggling with Impressionism. He felt like the loose brushwork, especially, was something that he was trying to get away from. And he was turning more towards a more linear and classicizing style. And later, when he was reflecting on the period to his dealer, Ambroise Vollard, he mentioned that he felt like he didn't understand painting or drawing, and that he had to start all over again from drawing to kind of forge a new way forward. And so the painting went through many revisions, and this kind of drawing was sort of essential in working through those issues. And so if you look in the final composition and you see that the figure with the basket, she's no longer wearing a winter coat. The fashions have changed, the times have changed, but the drawing is sort of an essential step in Renoir for helping him to kind of work through these compositional issues and transition towards this more linear style. And you can see there is a disjunction between the way that the woman with the basket in the foreground of the painting is depicted versus the other figures in the background who are a little bit more looser in their, Renoir depicted them a little bit more loosely in his approach. Sylvain mentioned that the drawings all come from the Mellon collection, and the Mellons were particularly passionate about racing and sporting art, and so Degas was one of their favorite artists. And so we have two pastels by Degas here, both depicting jockeys. These works show riders before the race has begun. Degas loved these kind of threshold moments where figures are preparing for and waiting for an event to happen. They're executed in pastel, which is a wonderful tool for draftsmen because it combines both color and line. Of all the Impressionists, Degas was the most prolific draftsman. He was very interested and devoted to Ingres. Like Ingres, he took a formative trip to Italy as a young man, and he was really struck by the fresco painting that he saw there, especially in Florence. And what appealed to him primarily about the frescoes was their matte quality. And he felt like pastel was a way that he could replicate this matteness. And so he would often alter commercially available pastels or sometimes even make his own in order to make sure that the medium really helped him to achieve these goals. We can see here too how much Degas is able to accomplish with just a few simple lines. We don't see the horse, we just see a single line here that kind of suggests the jockey sitting on the back of it. So he can accomplish so much with these simple lines. Degas would go on to become inspiration for a later generation of artists, including some that he would invite to the Impressionist exhibitions at the end of the 8 shows. One such artist was Jacques-Louis Forain, who shared Degas' interest in the racetrack. However, where Degas is interested in motion and potential, the jockeys who are about to start the race, horses running, Forain is much more interested in kind of the spectacle of modern life. And so this gouache, which is an opaque watercolor, is called the good tip. And we can see here 2 spectators who are kind of leaning over the edge of the fence to talk to a jockey who is giving them some suggestion about how to bet on the event. Forain is far less interested in the motion of the jockeys or who's going to win as much as he is interested in the kind of sights that you would see at the race. The racetrack offered an opportunity for people to see one another, observe the race and the fellow spectators, and also for them to be on display as well. So it was a real kind of site of exchange and vision in modern life, and that's something that Forain and Degas are both very interested in. Many of these drawings were initially created in sketchbooks that were ever intended by the artists to be seen publicly at all. I'm sure many of these artists would be totally shocked to find their works on view at a museum like this. The series of drawings that we're about to look at now, these 4 are all by Pissarro, period later in his life in the 1870s and 80s, where he was keeping a small pocket sketchbook that he would bring with him wherever he went in. He would kind of be able to sketch little scenes that he saw, scenes of modern life. Of all the Impressionists, Pissarro is the most interested in the figure. He's also the most interested in rural life and labor. He is living in Pontoise at this point, a small community north of Paris, and he is very invested in the worker. As you may know, he was a noted anarchist, and so he's kind of interested in these French peasants and their kind of role that they play in kind of forming the nation. And so we see here depictions of figures both at work and at rest, of fishermen, of milkmaids, and sometimes they are seen, stopping at their work. Other times they're engaged in it. Although they're not portraits, we don't necessarily see anyone's face or the particularities of their expressions. They are very humanizing, and we get a real sense of, he empathizes with them, emphasizes their humanity. And so I think that's a very particular perspective that we get from Pissarro that we don't always see with the other Impressionists. 2 other sketchbook pages, these watercolors by Cézanne. The first depicts a series of houses, and we get a sense of the way that Cézanne is really using negative space in his compositions. At the top, we see just a small splash of blue watercolor. He worked in watercolor extensively, but often applied the medium very judiciously. So here we have just this splotch that stands in for the blue of the whole sky. And we have a real sense of compressed space here, where the negative space is outlining the house for us, and the application of graphite gives us the shadows beyond. And so similarly, in the way that Cézanne was lauded for his use of unfinished canvas and areas of blank canvas left in his paintings, we can see him working through these ideas in his sketchbook. This we know came from a sketchbook page because we have another drawing on the other side of it, a sketch he made after a sculpture he saw at the Louvre. Unlike Pissarro, who kind of worked through sketchbooks one at a time, Cézanne moves back and forth between them. So we don't necessarily get a sense of his artistic progression when we look at them, because he, works in one for a few years and then maybe 10 years later, he might come back to the same one. So this drawing of the pine tree is a motif that he returned to regularly, both in multiple sketchbooks and in paintings. It was a tree that was located on property owned by his sister, and so he would visit it regularly. And again, we can see here his very judicious application of the watercolor media, a little bit of a yellow-brown that stands in for the whole trunk of the tree, areas of blue that are to suggest the sky coming through the branches, and a bit of red to add contrast. Again, he is really working with the paper support to emphasize negative space and its role in the composition. And we see just a slice of the tree. The trunk starts to fade away into the paper. The branches seem to go away. So we are just looking at this very limited section, and we can see him kind of working through the relationship of the branches to one another, of the shadows that are created at this particular part of the tree, and how this drawing might be useful to him later on when he was working on some of his painted compositions, and it became a way for him to sort of test out ideas and relationships between line and color. This work by Georges Seurat, The White Horse. Seurat had a relatively short career. He passes away as a young man from a fever, but he had a very active drawing practice, and in his short career made over 500 drawings. Friends talk about how he would often draw late at night by candlelight, and the play with shadow that you might imagine from working under these conditions is really evident in his drawing, especially here, where again, he's really using the negative space and the whiteness of the paper to emphasize the horse, and most of the applied media is in the background to create that sense of shadow. Seurat was extremely particular about his drawing materials. He used one specific brand of laid paper and Conte crayon, which are kind of a clay-based crayon that gives us this very velvety application of black. And the laid paper has the texture to it that comes through when the crayon is applied. And so it gives us this relationship between the support and the medium, where we see sometimes these small areas of white come through. And so in a way, he's still working with the pointillist dots that he's best known for in his paintings. It's just coming through differently in the materials. Instead of colored dots applied next to each other that your eye kind of blends together, we see this relationship between the whiteness of the paper that is coming through the specific way that he applies this crayon to the media. And so it's still the contrasting colors this time, it's just white and dark. Another work here is by Toulouse-Lautrec. This is from a series of drawings that Lautrec made in the late 1890s when he was recuperating at a sanatorium outside of Paris. Like I mentioned earlier, these kind of popular entertainment forms, the racetrack, the circus, were very popular with kind of bourgeois Parisians at the time. And Toulouse-Lautrec in particular felt a sense of camaraderie with circus performers and other people who were sort of on the fringes of society due to his own disability. And when he found himself in the sanatorium, he decided to create a series of drawings that he would use to prove to his doctors that he was mentally well enough to be released from the hospital. And he chose to make these drawings related to the circus, which was a subject that he knew well. And I'm not sure how well he was able to convince the doctors, but what fascinates me about this is that he turned to drawing as a kind of science, as a way to prove his kind of intellect and mental acuity. And so in a way, he's kind of turning back to a very old-fashioned way of using drawing, the same way that Ingres was incorporating it in a very linear, precise fashion. He's no longer trying to record the conditions around him, these scenes of modern life, to collect vignettes that he might use in later paintings. Instead, he's trying to equate drawing with science, with something precise and real that he can use to prove his own mental acuity. And then the final drawing in the exhibition is this early work by Van Gogh that he made when he was still living with his family in the Netherlands. This is a scene of a marsh near the village of Etten. It's an ink drawing with a little bit of wash. And we see here Van Gogh's very precise use of line. We have all of this careful cross-hatching and repeated lines that give us a sense of the different surfaces and textures, the way that the light is reflecting off of the water, the reeds that are emerging from the pond, and the clouds going by above. And what fascinates me here is that we can see Van Gogh kind of working through a number of influences and sources. This very high horizon line makes us think of the Dutch painting that he would have been exposed to in the Netherlands at this time. The repeated line work reminds me a lot of printmaking, not only the Japanese prints that we know Van Gogh was fond of, but also the etching revival prints that he would have been accustomed to at this time. The subject matter of the water lily pond is something that he would have gotten from Monet, who was gardening Giverny, was getting a lot of attention at this moment, and is something that Van Gogh would have been familiar with. But even though this is a very early work, especially in the sky, we see a real sense of movement and exuberance, and we can see this drawing prefiguring sort of the bold expressionist works like Starry Night and the cypress trees that we know and love from Van Gogh. And so Van Gogh's sort of personal struggles are well documented, and we imagine at this time he's having tension with his family about his choice to become an artist. He's struggling financially, and drawing is a way for him to kind of work through some of these issues, synthesize these influences. The materials of paper and pen are much less expensive than oil paint. It's much more forgiving if you make a mistake or you want to try something and you're not sure it's going to work out. And so I love that this one is at the end of the show, because in a way it really is demonstrating the whole thesis that works on paper and drawing especially are a way to try new things, to test out things, to be your most experimental. And in this year where we are celebrating Impressionism, it's important to remember that in the first Impressionist exhibition, 40% of the works on view were works on paper, not just drawings, but also prints. And throughout the whole 8 exhibitions, at least half of the works exhibited were works on paper. And so I am looking forward to chatting more about this with Faya.
I'm going to come in the camera right now just for a moment. Thank you, Teresa. My goodness. Everybody will want to be here for a tour like that to give us so much, 21 drawings. But we do have a lot of questions.
Oh, great.
So if it's all right with, I'm saying we're going to go back to the Pissarro.
Perfect.
So
Oh, excellent.
send it back. And go back. I will have to go here. The first one was green paper. What kind of paper was it? And how often would these artists opt to use colored paper to emphasize the subjects of their drawings? Or is this example with green paper a rarity?
I would say it's not a total rarity. You know, it's not something that they were doing all of the time, but it's certainly not an outlier either. This was green wove paper. We don't really know much about it beyond that. Unlike Seurat, Pissarro was not particularly precious about his drawing materials. And especially this early in his career, he was young. He was, as I said, trying out new things, kind of synthesizing the Barbizon school. But there's a long tradition of draftsmen working on blue paper in particular, because it was well suited to seeing contrast. You could add white crayon and kind of emphasize things. And so the use of green paper is a little bit different. Like I said, I think he is trying to evoke that he would have had, and it gives him another color when he's just working with the black graphite. But it, you know, it's not totally unusual, but it's not something that he did all of the time. And there are other examples of the Impressionists working on colored paper. No. Excellent.
But as long as we're in the room, I know you love all your children, but maybe there's one or two that you become very attached to that you want to say a little bit more about, and why you've either changed your mind about them, or how did you, and why would you choose them when I only give you 2?
Sure. One that I am particularly fond of is the Morisot watercolor. It really, when doing research about Morisot and realizing the kind of vast array of nautical related imagery in her oeuvre, I was really struck by how different the subject matter is from the type of imagery that we typically associate with her. And I think it really allowed me to see her in a new way, and learning the story of her kind of struggling and getting such kind of hostile criticism when working out in plein air also kind of gave me the opportunity to think about her in a new way. And so that was sort of exciting for me. And, you know, we have a wonderful seascape by her downstairs in our permanent collection galleries, but now that you know, once you see something, you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. And I've been pleased to find examples of Morisot's ship-related scenes elsewhere too. And so that's been very fun.
Second choice?
The other one, I also love the Cézanne watercolors, especially this one. it is so fascinating to me, this very judicious application of watercolor and the way that he uses it to like a small part to stand in for the whole. And I love that we see, just this little bit of blue, and you might think at first that maybe it's just an accident or he's kind of clearing off his brush to make another drawing, but I really don't think so. I think here it is just an example of him using just like this bit of blue to give us the impression of the sky on a sunny day.
Very much. We have a question. Collecting. So
Okay.
I'll give you a second to catch your breath, but have Sylvain come take my microphone.
Sure.
We can. Oh dear.
Thank you, Teresa.
So the question is, can the VMFA curators tell us about the Mellons as collectors? Did the Mellons work with any dealers or advisors as they built their collection of works on paper? Did they collect them with the intention of donating them to the VMFA, or was it for their personal enjoyment?
Well, this is an excellent question and very absolutely central in what we have here and what we can show. So the interest of the Mellons, especially, so the Mellon collection has many different forms, many different specialties or area of specialization. And there is a taste of Paul Mellon, there's a taste of Paul and Bunny Mellon, in the sense of them collecting together. And as far as French Impressionism, pre-Impressionism, post-Impressionism, and Impressionism, what I like particularly to think is to think about the fact that they were collecting together and that this was something that was uniting them as a couple. It's something that they started to do very early. They got married in 1948. Bunny Mellon was Paul Mellon's second wife. And very, very soon after their wedding, they started collecting. Bunny Mellon was very influential in converting, in a sense, Paul to French art. Paul was a British art enthusiast, and he was Anglo-American himself. And it took the influence of Bunny, who had been a Francophile since the earlier years of her life, to convert him to the idea of collecting something else than British art, and especially something else than British sporting art. They were highly advised. Indeed, most of the collection was acquired thanks to dealers and regular visits to dealers in New York, dealers in London, and dealers in France. In New York, the Wildenstein Gallery played an extremely important role in forming the collection. In Paris, you can think about the Hector Bram Gallery, which was very, very important in supplying Impressionist works. Agnew's in London. You can think of the Fashionfeld Gallery in Zurich as well. The Mellons used to travel a lot, having residences in Paris. As far as Mrs. Mellon was concerned, she spent every year an important part of her time in France. And they had a house in New York, of course, where they spent a long time and visited galleries, again, as really something that they would do together. And making the decision and making choices together was something that united them very much.
So now we have one more question, perhaps, that you might want to answer, and that is, someone mentions that this exhibition would be a good complement to the one that just opened at the National Gallery on 1874, the birth of Impressionism. I didn't tell people when I started talking that this show is up till January 1st into the next year, and the National Gallery of Art show, which opens to the public on Sunday, will be up into January as well. So you can catch them both.
Absolutely, and I think maybe Teresa could also talk about it. It was her idea, which I think was really excellent, to ensure that we had at VMFA a sort of original way of celebrating the 150th anniversary of first exhibition of the independent movement that was to become the Impressionist movement. I think it's quite exquisite and really wonderful that the Mellon collection just gives us this wonderful ensemble of artworks that illustrate the specific role, not necessarily the one that you imagine necessarily when you think about Impressionism, then drawing, sketching plays in the mindset, in the development of artists from the generation of Impressionists to develop the style.
Thank you so much. We're now going to sit for a moment and ask Teresa some of the more questions that have come in. Thank you very much, Silva. Now get your microphone back on. There you are.
I think I'm all set. Thank you.
One of the questions that have been asked again is the movement of drawings. Did these artists sell the drawings? I mean, you have 21 different cases in here. Did they sell them to collectors, or did they keep them for their own use, as you mentioned on several occasions?
So we do know of examples where the Impressionists sold their drawings. As I mentioned, many drawings were included in the Impressionist exhibitions, and these tended to be larger, more finished compositions, especially pastel, portraits, larger modern life scenes. I would say the drawings that we have on view here, none of them would have been intended for sale. And I think in part that's why they give us an opportunity to see these experimental techniques and practices. If you look closely at a number of them, the Boudin, for example, or the Degas, you can see the stamps with the artist's initials. These are applied later by the estate after the artists have passed away. And so I think in most cases, these drawings ended up on the market because the executors of the estate saw their value. By the time the Impressionists, many of them lead long lives. They live well into the 20th century. And so by the time of their passing, they're no longer these revolutionary and misunderstood artists that they were in the late 60s and early 70s. They are household names. And so the executors of their estate understood the value of the drawings on the market. And that's also why we see these examples of sketchbooks that have been taken apart, because instead of selling one sketchbook, you have the opportunity to sell, all of the drawings inside of it. So these, I think, were mostly instances of artists, as I said, practicing, testing something out, sort of collecting a series of scenes or vignettes that they thought might be useful for them later down the line. They weren't necessarily thought of as finished compositions. And you'll see also that outside of those estate stamps that I mentioned, most of them are not signed. However, these artists had a very precise and particular style, so they're all very safely attributed to these artists.
One of the things, again, you use the word experiment a couple of times. And one of our questions from our listeners is, were any of these more experimental works shown during the artist's lifetime? So of the works here, with the exception of possibly the Boudin, but is that the case? Were some of their more experimental works shown?
I think their most experimental drawings they were making just for themselves. They likely would have shown people who visited their studio, including each other, but they were not things that were on view at the Impressionist exhibitions or other instances where these artists were showing their work.
Great, that was a wonderful answer. That we had a question back to the highly attractive Pissarro. Just a question, not that you have to get up and answer now, but anybody looks again. Is there a face behind Pissarro's pine tree? So that will be for.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
I will definitely look into that later. I have not noticed it, but as I said, these works really reward close and continued looking, so it's possible that it could be there. But I do think it is. I mean, it is clearly a landscape, and yeah, the Impressionists and Pissarro in particular were not ones to kind of sneak in secret symbols in their work. So I think it's maybe unlikely, but you never know.
You never know. I think one question too, with the idea of experiment, and then when you have talked about works and these works and others, we have a question is, have you been able to trace whether these drawings were ever incorporated into actual paintings, or that that you can see that this is a partial sketch and then it's moved on into something?
So we know that for certain with the Renoir drawing in particular, that it was he reworked that painting a number of times, especially the figure in the foreground that Suzanne Valadon posed for. And so we know that this drawing is his attempt to kind of work through that. You know, she changes clothes, she changes posture, but he's kind of fidgeting with the person in the painting. The other one that we know is related to paintings is the Cézanne pine tree. He did a whole series of other drawings, but also paintings of this particular tree. And I think the watercolors gave him an opportunity to kind of work out the way that light and color and shadow are working in this particular segment of the tree. So that's why we just see the one part, but the final painted composition is the whole tree and a bit of the landscape around it. As far as the others, you know, Toulouse-Lautrec did a whole series of circus paintings. So we don't have a kind of a one-to-one relationship between our drawing and a painting, but it is related to this series that he was working on when he was in the sanatorium. And there are paintings that came after that that are related to the drawings. And then, as I said, you know, Delacroix created this series of botanical still lifes in watercolor that he referred to when he was looking back at when he was working on these more exuberant still lifes that included many types of flowers that he created in the 1830s. And so again, we don't have a kind of necessarily a very specific painting, but we do see daffodils in his later painted still life. So we can imagine that he was kind of working on these in preparation for that. And, you know, the Boudon figures and the Pissarro sketches, each of those artists work figures into their larger compositions. And it's possible that they were kind of referring to similar sketches like these for some of those paintings.
We had a specific question about one word, sorry, one word. It's also one word, and that is the painting, the tip,
The good tip.
the good tip.
So,
and you want to tell us again who the artist is, just so they can put it up on the screen? It's a full, huh?
sure, the artist is Jean-Louis Ferrand. So as the Impressionists exhibitions are moving forward, the group that is involved changes over time. Only Pissarro participates in every single exhibition. Morisot participates in 7 out of the 8. The only one she skips out on is the one that happens right after her daughter is born. But the other artists and the folks involved were more fluid. As I mentioned, Boudon and also Cézanne participated in the first Impressionist exhibition, but didn't participate in later exhibitions. Seurat participates in only the last one. But especially in these later exhibitions, Degas in particular is eager to invite new artists in, new voices in, and especially younger artists. And Ferrand is one of this member of a group of younger artists that Degas becomes particularly interested in and who he decides to invite to participate with them. And as you'll see, you know, the two of them shared similar interests in subject and composition. When we think of Degas, we think of the racetrack, but the other quintessential Degas subject is the ballet, and that's also something that Ferrand was interested in. And so he's sort of like an acolyte, a student of Degas, but not as well known as some of the other figures on view in this room.
Something that the public is often interested in, but hesitate to ask, and that is, after selecting the works that you were going to put in here, how did you decide where they were going to go?
It's a good question. And I kind of went through a number of things. I knew I wanted to start with a small section of work from the early 19th century to kind of set the stage and explain and visually explain what was different about the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist drawings. But I first thought maybe I would do that and then install the rest of the drawings thematically, thinking, because especially with the Mellon collection, we have, you know, a lot of horse racing scene, we've got a lot of landscape. We had a number of figure drawings, both Pissarro and Boudon's relationship to kind of rural workers. There were some resonances there. And I played around with that for a while, but decided that in part because all of these artists are kind of reacting to one another, it felt very choppy, and that you would move from something like the very precise Pissarro tree to, you know, Morisot's nautical scene to the Degas, or the, pardon me, the Cézanne pine tree watercolor, and that maybe it was actually more clarifying if we installed it in a chronological way that would kind of show the development and the way that these artists are all sort of engaging with the particular moment in time. And so that is what I ended up with in the end.
Yeah. The other question is also a Mellon, about the Mellons, and that is, are any of the drawings here related to anything else that the Mellons collected? Is there, for example, a study for something in their collection, or are they separate?
That's a good question. So the paintings that we know are related, the Cézanne pine tree painting is in Brazil, and the Renoir painting is in the National Gallery in London. So not the National Gallery, that also is a repository of many works from Paul and Bunny Mellon. But they do, the artists that they were particularly interested in, Boudon, Pissarro, Degas, well represented here.
Yes.
And especially they had a number of horse racing scenes, which we have on view both here, and there are also some in the National Gallery. But our pastels are not necessarily connected to a particular Degas painting. These are things that Degas was making at the racetrack. It was much easier to bring your sketch pad and your pastels to the races than to set up an easel along the racetrack. So in a way, something else that I maybe should have touched on earlier is that these drawing materials are portable and easy to use. So they're kind of the ideal media for painting from the motif. We know that artists sent up their easels and painted outdoors, but in many cases, they also made drawings and later made paintings in their studio.
Well, we just have a couple of minutes, but I wanted to say, just for those of you who are going to come to the museum here, we're upstairs in this drawing here in this gallery, but this is a museum also extremely well known for its Impressionist and various Post-Impressionist paintings. So if you want to go up and down the Mid-Atlantic and go up and see the show in Washington, you can choose to start in Richmond and go to Washington to see the 1874 exhibition, but you really will have a full immersion in this topic at the moment. We're coming to the end now, and I would like to thank all of our participants, and really thank you very much, all of the staff at the VMFA for doing this program, and a hearty thanks to the Villa Albertine of the Embassy of France. The very last slide has on it the VMFA website and also a link to what is called Collection Stories. This is a part of the marvelous website of the VMFA where you can learn in more depth, and you can take what you learned today from everyone and take it a bit further. And I want to thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Faya. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.